session will In today's session, we will be talking about zero trust for users of Prisma Access, specifically focusing on user-based and identity-based control that is possible with Prisma Access in terms of security inspection as well as security enforcement. So we're going to begin with and talking about where we are today. We've seen a rather permanent shift in the last 3 years in terms of how users do work today. And work's no more a location, it's more about an activity that you do. And this applies to all users and devices as well as locations. Majority of the organizations today are adopting a hybrid work model, supporting either partially remote, completely remote, or anything in between. But it's basically a hybrid way of doing work. It's about more flexibility and no more tied to a location. Now, this kind of brings in the flexibility comes at a cost of security enforcement and the threat surface that kind of increases with users being everywhere. So you have users that are on your campus, working from home, working on the go, and these could be using home devices, BYOD devices, work laptops, everything in between. And on the other side, you have applications which are no longer hosted in your data centers. These are applications which are either in your data center or SaaS applications, which we're going to see majority of the applications, the enterprise applications today. And these, when you're going to think about users connecting to these applications, prior to ZTNA, you have security access brokers, which provided access permissions only when access was requested from the users. And that led to a lot of issues. And what we'll be talking about today is ZTNA 2.0 in terms of how a completely new approach in terms of users accessing any applications anywhere. And for those applications, we provide least privilege access, continuous trust assessment, security for all apps, whether it's private or SaaS, continuous security inspection for those applications, and data protection everywhere. So we're going to be talking about that and how user identity plays a role in it. So we're going to think about zero trust or ZTNA 2.0 architecture. It begins with a device, user, and application. That's the core of it, right? Every time a user tries to log in to an application, for every session, you authenticate the user when the user comes in, you have the device credentials. And for every session that is created, you have an application ID. And for each of those, you do a continuous trust assessment for that user. Even if the user is authenticated, for every application, every session, you have a continuous trust assessment that goes in. In addition to that, you also do continuous security inspection because you have wildfire, like for malware analysis, threat prevention, DNS filtering, URL filtering. You do the security inspection on a continuous basis. And based on that, you have rules or you have policies that are enforced, could be enforced multi-factor auth, quarantine this device, enable decryption, block access, whatever it is. But it is done on a continuous trust assessment and continuous security inspection. And just kind of to stretch that further, right? We also integrate with external systems. So this is not just getting threat signals from just Palo Alto systems. We also integrate with external systems, and we'll be talking about some of those things in today's session. So now let's talk about user ID. And one thing that I want to stress about is in this session, we'll be talking about user ID, which is essentially user to IP mapping. But there's more to it, right? There is, we don't expect users to kind of do write policies per user. It's done at the group level. So how are you going to think about user and user to group mapping? How are you going to think about user authentication? Because there is a lot of layered complexity when it talks about distributed and large scale systems that comes in when you think about enforcing user policies, and users at the crux of this entire ZTNA 2.0 framework. So let's kind of talk about what is user ID? User ID at its crux is user to IP mapping. And this was written or introduced by Palo Alto to write identity-based policies like more than a decade ago. This is like foundational to Prisma Access and Palo Alto policies. And it applies not just Prisma Access, NGFWs as well. Now, Zero Trust requires implementing a policy with least privilege, and that's where we need to kind of understand the user specifics at all times to write really effective policies to block or allow access to any applications that the users want to access. Now, just kind of providing what is user ID? User ID is the ability to kind of write user mapping. This is part of foundational single pass software architecture. So instead of writing IP addresses, roles or policies by IP addresses, you basically do it by roles. Now, when I got to talk more about what are we seeing and why is there complexity. So one of the big market shifts or trends that we're seeing out there is identity is migrating from on-prem AD to cloud IDP. So we see a lot of customers adopting SAML first for authentication. We have customers migrating from on-prem methods like Radius, Kerberos, LDAP to cloud-based authentication. And this is primarily driven due to two-factor and MFA requirements, which are aligned strategic with the CISO goals. And one of the things is just kind of based on the survey, this is like about a year back or maybe a year or two ago, but 87% of organizations were thinking or already in the process of migrating to cloud-based identity. So we're seeing this trend in a lot of users. And that's where the CIE or the Cloud Identity Engine that we'll kind of talk about comes in. So what is CIE? All right, so CIE is the Cloud Identity Engine, which enables a cloud scale, single sign-on and directory service for both cloud native and on-prem identity providers. So CIE integrates with Azure AD, Okta, Google IDP, but in addition, it also integrates with other directories through SCIM, and also integrates with on-prem Active Directory that you have. And once it integrates with those, now Prisma Access can basically integrate directly into the Cloud Identity Engine, and you have a very simple way of setting up policy. So you don't have to go to Prisma Access instance, or if you have multiple tenants, you don't have to go to each Prisma Access. You go to Cloud Identity Engine, set up your directories, and Prisma Access will work directly with the Cloud Identity Engine. So it's a horizontally scalable cloud hosted platform to enable directory services and cloud authentication as well for all your users. All right, so let's kind of dig deeper and talk about group policies, right? So we spoke about user identity. It's basically IP to user mapping, and Prisma Access gets that user ID mapping from multiple sources. But more important is group mapping. How do you essentially give the users the ability to write policies like, instead of kind of saying Joe's belongs to finance, you basically say finance and program or product management are not allowed access to Slack. Like it's an example policy that we expect users to write. Now, to enable that, there are few key services. One is directory sync. How do you sync all those users and group mappings from your on-prem and cloud directories to Prisma Access? And the second is user ID redistribution. If a user logs into, let's say, an on-prem firewall, how do you redistribute that from the on-prem firewall or on-prem NGFW to Prisma Access and Prisma Access horizontally across? And there are two aspects. Right? One is you write a group policy in, let's say, Panorama or Cloud Management. You write policies that finance is not allowed access to Slack. Now, when that policy is pushed to Prisma Access, how does Prisma Access get those user rules, and how does it does the user ID, which is the IP address or user ID mapping, to enforce this policy. So these are like the core concepts. And the way it works is on the left, you would have identity providers, which is on-prem AD or cloud directories. They sync the users and group via Cloud Identity Engine Directory Sync service. So from the directory sync service, you basically are sending the user groups to the Panorama or cloud management to write group-based policies. And then you're also getting the user and group and the enforcement on the Prisma Access, which is basically the service SPNs or the nodes. Now, once you kind of have that, when a traffic comes in, the policy is pushed down from Panorama or cloud management to Prisma Access, and any traffic that is coming in is enforced on Prisma Access. So as you can see from the picture, Cloud ID Engine is pretty central to how we enforce policies on Prisma Access. Moving on, and we're going to talk about a lot of these things in our demo as well. So moving on, we're going to talk about cloud authentication. Now, we see a lot of users that want to kind of move to simplify their authentication solution, right? So with Prisma Access, you can kind of do authentication for native methods like local, radius, LDAP, but also the cloud authentication service. We integrate with Okta, Google IDP, Azure AD, and SCIM is also supported. But for those cloud directory providers, we can authenticate it on Cloud ID Engine itself. So it's a very simplified way of authenticating your users. In addition to that, there's something new that we introduced recently with 3.2.1, which is multi-authentication. So let's say you have a use case where you have users that belong to contractors belong to Ping ID. You have your employees that belong to Okta, and you have these multiple cloud providers, and you kind of have some other services that rely on certificates. Now, through a single authentication profile, you can actually have all those devices authenticate with Prisma Access, and behind the scenes kind of work with all these different providers with different profiles. And that's also something new that is introduced in Prisma Access in 3.2.1 release. The other thing that I want to talk about is we see a lot of users that say, I have an on-prem service or on-prem authentication method like Radius, and I want to migrate to Prisma Access, but I want to migrate seamlessly. I don't want to kind of go through all the different. I want to migrate gradually. So in 3.2.1, we actually introduced a multi-portal solution. So if you have an on-prem identity provider, and you can enable this feature to kind of create a second portal on the same Prisma Access tenant to enable SAML authentication. And then from that perspective, you can now enable Radius and SAML for your users and gradually migrate users from Radius to SAML without kind of doing a huge lift and shift or kind of abrupt migration. So this kind of enables you to enable SAML for a set of users, test it out, and we have a few large customers kind of trying this today, successfully trying this today. And finally, one of the other things that you also want to talk about is cloud dynamic user group. So one of the things that I'm going to show in one of the first few visuals was how you can now, how Prisma Access can actually get risk signals from external systems. So this is one of those systems like Azure AD. We can get a risk signal from Azure AD, and based on those attributes, based on the scores, you can now enforce policies on Prisma Access to basically migrate users or enforce policies. An example, if Okta provides or Azure AD provides us a signal that for some reason this user is at high risk because they try to authenticate from multiple systems, or they try to authenticate from a different part of the world that they shouldn't have. Based on that, they increase the risk score, and based on a risk score, you have the ability on Prisma Access to enforce policies, which could be MFA, or in some scenarios, you could also enforce policies such as just kind of block the user, right, or kind of disable the user and ask them to contact IT. So there are multiple possibilities, and we're kind of just scratching the surface on this. There'll be a lot of work and a lot of things that will be kind of building on top of this in the coming months. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Nishit, who's going to walk through a demo, and then after that we'll come back and then take a look at the Q&A. All right, Nishit.
Thank you, Anish. So let me start with sharing my screen. Hope you guys are able to see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Perfect. So this is our Cloud Identity Engine portal that's available within the Cloud Manager. And here I have two different directories that I have synced, where I have one with Okta and the other one with Azure. So for onboarding directories, it's pretty straightforward, wherein you can either select on-premise directory, which uses a Cloud Identity Agent to be installed on the Active Directory for it to talk to CIE. And the other one being Cloud Directory itself, wherein we support Azure, SCIM, Okta, and Google. Now, after we have configured the directory itself and goes through the syncing process, you will be able to see all the users, devices, or the groups that are pulled from that directory. Now, let's look into one of the groups here. So Anish was earlier talking about the dynamic user group, the Cloud DAG, which is available with Azure today. And here I have three different Cloud DAGs configured based on the different risk signals that we get from Azure, and we pull the users based on the risk associated on the Azure end and put them into the respective group. So let's click on one of the groups here. So as you can see, based on the risk level, Azure has put these many users or marked these many users as high, because of which we have added these users dynamically into this group based on their risk signal that we received. Now, in terms of configuring Cloud DAGs itself, we have different categories available within Cloud DAG, where you can basically do attribute-based on-demand assignment or risk protection, which is with the help of Azure risk signals. So in the on-demand assignment itself, you can basically create static entries where you can put users that you learn from the directory itself into the groups. The risk protection itself, wherein you can provide the name for the group that you want to use, followed by the risk level, where it can be either equal to high, medium, or low, or you can select multiple values to be like, based on the name, I can select low or medium and create a group to add both risk signals or the users marked with either low or medium into this group. So that's one part of the directory itself. The other part of the directory being the authentication service, where you can configure authentication types. Here I have one with Azure. Both of them are actually with Azure, where it's doing SAML authentication, and the other authentication which can be done with help of certificate-based, which is the client certificate authentication. Now, once you configure SAML, which is pretty straightforward, which is you downloading a metadata from here, importing into your directory provider, and similarly exporting the metadata from that identity provider and uploading it here. And you will be able to basically configure the SAML profiles for that. Now, within profiles, you have multiple different ways of configuring authentication, which is going to be either single authentication mode or multiple authentication mode. So within multiple, I get the option to basically select multiple different directories that I have for authentication. So as Anish was explaining, based on the domain that you provide, you can basically redirect the users to their respective identity provider for authentication instead of configuring single SAML profile across different services. And again, within authentication sequence, SAML is not one of the supported method, because of which you can use multi-authentication service provided by CIE for redirecting respective users to different IDP providers. Now, let's go to our cloud managed portal, Fox Tenant, which is basically how it ties into our cloud managed, right? So let's talk about security policies in here. So here I have, let's see. So here I have one of the policies where I've configured based on the groups where I can define user-based or group-based policies. And I can also call out my Cloud DUG, which is the Cloud Dynamic User Group, in here within the policy for enforcement for any of these traffic. Right here. And I can basically allow the access, deny the access, or basically then based on that, you can define this. These are our traditional security policies. The other thing that I would like to cover as well would be with respect to authentication itself. Wherein once you configure the authentication profile on the CIE, you can come in here and select the authentication method as Cloud Identity Engine, and you should see the respective profiles populated in here. And in turn, you can use this profile across explicit proxy, global protect, or even for your step-up auth using captive portal or authentication rules. So that's about it for the demo from my end. Thank you, guys. Anish, back to you.
Thanks, Nishit. I know there were a few questions. Let me kind of walk through a couple of slides, and then we'll kind of jump into the questions and answer them directly. So we did take a look at quick look at the demo, and I want to kind of step back and kind of talk about, there are a lot of features that we've recently released with Prisma Access for user identity in the last few releases. We definitely have the CIE integration, and this is something that we've had for a couple of years. But then we also have terminal service agents, which enable basically for remote desktops, for Azure VDI, Windows 2019, and Citrix. We enable user ID policies. SAML migration with the multi-level portal that came in 3.2. And then we also have a lot more enhancements in terms of group sync error. We optimize that workflow where previously we used to run into issues where if the user ID or the group mappings are not correct on Panorama or cloud management, that used to lead to some errors, and we've kind of fixed a lot of those backends. So a lot of operational enhancements for user ID. Again, I want to remind for just kind of in terms of where we are today. Today, Palo Alto has been recognized as a leader in the 2023 Gartner Magic Quadrant for SSE. And Palo Alto is one of the is the only vendor that has been recognized as a leader for both SD-WAN as well as secure service edge. So just want to kind of remind that. And I think we're going to jump into Q&As. I see a few Q&As, so I'll kind of go one by one, and then me and Nishit will answer some of them.